presentation, and then I'll try to leave 10, 15 minutes at the end for questions. Yeah, but thanks for coming, and I hope you enjoy this this presentation of my thesis, which is looking at why does Perth stand alone? Why is Perth the only city in our state? And I'll give you more detail on that. Before I go further, though, I would like to acknowledge my supervisors, Professor Fiona Haslam-McKenzie and Dr. Julian Bolater. And I just want to recognize their stellar support of this project. They've been great champions of the research, and I really couldn't have done it without you, so thank you so much. So before I get into this topic, I wanted to give a brief personal introduction just to sort of connect you to why I was interested in this topic in Australia. And on the left column, I'm showing the United States, which is where I'm from, as it was when my grandfather was born in 1885, and then as it was when I was born in 1979. And you can see from these images how the economic geography of the U.S. transformed in that time period. When my grandfather was a boy, a place like Los Angeles was actually 3 times smaller than Perth. And meanwhile, or when I was born, there had been a huge shift into the what's called the Sun Belt to the west and into the south. And a place like Los Angeles had gone from a remote village to a city of 17.5 million. And this really, I was always really interested in this history. I was a student of history, and I thought that was really fascinating. And when I moved to Australia, it colored how I viewed this state. And I had 2 sort of working assumptions that sort of gave me rose-tinted glasses. And the first was I assumed that Perth would be like a young San Francisco or a young Los Angeles, and that it would boom. And that was 20 years ago, so I think that one largely came true. And then the other one was that Western Australia would be like a young California, and that second cities in the state would boom. There would be more than one city that would do well. And as you all would probably know, that's not true. So what I noticed was only Perth boomed, and this fed my curiosity. I wanted to understand why. And in this image, I'm showing sort of a visual representation of the centralization I'm talking about. In each Australian state, development is centralized in the state capital. And this is a satellite image or satellite composite of settlement in Australia. And you can see the white dots represent where most people are. And quantitatively, you can actually measure centralization. I'll be using this term a lot, called urban primacy. Primacy measures the degree to which settlement is centralized. And one really simple way of measuring primacy is to take the largest city's population and divide it by the next 2 combined. And these are the measures for all Australian states and the larger territories of the NT. And I wanted to just sort of set this baseline that all states have actually very high measures of primacy. We just have variations in extremes. So a measure of 2.0, which means the largest city is twice as big as the next 2 cities combined, is considered a very high measure of primacy. And that's actually our lowest measure in Tasmania. And then you can see in WA, we have really extreme measures, particularly given the size of our state. To have an 18.1 is really quite something. And just a historic perspective, these are largely stable measures that, if anything, they've increased since federation, since colonization. But this was something observed of Australia right out the gate, and it's still very much apparent today. And lastly, it's expected to increase moderately in this century. So unless COVID were really to disrupt that, as of recent projections, we still expect the capital city regions to gain the lion's share of growth. Now, my question, what's driving centralization, is not a new question in Australia. It's actually been examined pretty extensively. It's often attributed to a harsh environment, that Australia was founded in a period of modernization, so maybe that only necessitated one city. We have a low population, we're isolated, maybe these things centralize things. And also the capitals had first mover advantages. So of course they would win because they started first. They have infrastructure accumulated, etc. But what if I told you that in the last 30 years, scholars, particularly from the area of institutional economics, are beginning to relate the shape of the settlement pattern to institutions? And this is a satellite picture here of the Korean Peninsula, and it's a really good illustration of the thrust of institutional economics, that your institutions will sculpt how economic development will manifest. And you can see there's clearly a difference between North and South Korea. So the research gap my project dealt with was that theories of primacy in Australian states haven't really dealt or reckoned with this institutional theory. And internationally, primacy is almost always attributed to institutions. So I wanted to understand, is this theory relevant in our states? So in this slide, I'll just give you sort of what are institutional economics saying about these patterns. On the left, you have, these are same scale photos, by the way. The one on the right is not zoomed in. And generally what institutional economics are saying is decentralized patterns, so like Canada and the United States, which are featured there on the left. If you were to dive into what their governments look like, you'll find that government power is devolved through each tier of government. So as you go down, you'll find that actually each tier still has quite a lot of responsibility and power. Whereas on the right, that's the western part of Russia, you'll find that centralized patterns are associated with top-heavy intergovernmental balances of power. So as you go down the tiers, they're going to get weaker and weaker. So again, my question was, are these explanations relevant to why we see primacy in Australian states? Why don't non-capital city regions grow? Why didn't any regions grow like Perth? So I'm putting it in 3 different ways just to reiterate this. This is the base question. And my thesis is built around 5 different papers. So as the research progressed, thankfully, I was able to develop 5 papers. It was actually a really fun project. And I'm going to walk you through all 5 of them, and that's really my presentation. So the first one looks at major centers, and what I wanted to understand was if we could identify statistical relationships between the size of a major center or a city and its location-specific factors, like its environment, or if it was a capital, or if it had certain economic infrastructure. And then the second paper was the same question, but now asked of local government areas, so cities as political entities. The third paper, those pyramids I shared before, I wanted to create one or ask that question of Australia. What does our balance of power look like in Australia? The fourth paper looked at what do experts think of this? So what do scholars who have examined primacy in Australia, what do politicians who can affect change or have dealt with centralization, what do they think is going on? And then the last paper is a case of primacy disruption. I'll share with you a brief case study. And this gets at the question of why should we care about urban primacy? Why does it matter in the first place? So in terms of the first paper, the map on the left, those little dots, that's the sample of major centers. So the threshold for inclusion in this study was that the center had a population of 10,000 or more. And then I created a city of or a model of city populations and looked for correlations between that population and these factors that are featured in the table on the right. And if it's highlighted green, it means that it had a relationship with population, a positive one, meaning if it had this feature, the population was higher. But state capital city status is bright green and bolded because it was by far the strongest predictor of size. And this, we use regressions, or I checked for correlations once every decade from 1911 to 2016. So there were 11 separate regressions. And what's interesting about this, because you may say, well, how can it be that rainfall doesn't affect population? How can it be that if a city has a river, it isn't bigger than ones that don't have a river? If you look at the sample, you can see that actually a lot of those areas that don't have rivers weren't even able to be included. So our sample already shows a lot of environmental limitations. What these results tell you is within this sample, these other factors won't tell you whether one is big or not. It means that there are small centers in Australia that have populations over 10,000 that have comparable natural endowments to the capitals. So I put this little image of a oasis with a no sign on it to emphasize the point that the idea that the capitals are these environmental oases really didn't stand up to this statistical scrutiny. The second paper looked at LGAs, and you might wonder, why would we look at LGAs separate from major centers? Why would you do 2 different measures? And I wanted to just share a map of what the local government areas look like in Western Australia, and you can see how they're sort of like fractals over the capital. That is, when you're close to the capital, they're very small geographically, and as you go out, they get very large. And that one at the top on the right image there, the Shire of East Pilbara, is actually bigger than Germany. So they become enormous. Whereas the ones in the city are very small. And that's really interesting. So doing this statistical analysis of local government areas stands to tell us a different story because we have very different catchments of cities. And I wanted to share this table, which compares Australian, Canadian, and American cities, both their urban definitions of a city and their municipal, or the political entity of a local government. And if you did that in Canada or the US, you generally have the same set of cities. If I wanted to look at cities as urban, in their urban definition, or as cities proper, or municipal, I kind of had the same list, give or take one or two might be out. But in Australia, you have a totally different list of cities. So by the urban metric, we have the 5 biggest capitals, but by the municipal metric, Queensland is number 1. It has been since the 1930s. And then, to an international audience, probably an unrecognizable list of cities. So this statistical analysis was interesting because it would give us it would tell a different story. So I'm showing the regressions from the first period to the last to show you how things changed. And the factors were slightly different, but generally similar. So what we found was with LGAs tend to be larger if they're near the coast, if they're near a river, a perennial river, if they're on the East Coast. And those became more important as time went by. And that's because in the early days of Australian settlement, inland mining settlements were much larger relative than they are now. Proximity to major seaport was always important. But the real thing to take away from this slide is that institutions were involved from the beginning. But what's interesting is in the beginning, the largest cities in Australia actually were the capitals. Sydney was the biggest city in 1911. But state governments progressively broke them down into smaller pieces with the exclusion of Queensland into much smaller local government areas. And despite that, though, by 2016, still being proximate to the state parliament was still a hugely predictive variable for the size of the city and its population. So some of the take-home messages of this study were, one, just in pulling together the sample, which included LGAs with populations over 2,500, it was a very volatile group of cities, and the municipal geography where they were was very fractured. It's not only broken up, but it's chopping and changing through time. States are deliberately striving for evenness among their LGAs. So once an LGA would have too much of a population, it would usually be broken up into pieces. And there was the creation of what I called micro capitals. So Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide were actually broken down into smaller pieces to be these really tiny local government areas. So while the metro bears their name, if you really look at how many people live in that city proper, you'll find it's a very small number of people. Interestingly, though, while this is happening, you see the emergence of these much larger capital proximate local government areas like Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, Central Coast, and they're actually in the top 10 of the largest cities proper, and they're also becoming really important in the urban centers. So it's a interesting thing that these outer metropolitan cities are becoming very big and important in terms of the urban hierarchy. So I think I'll stop on this one, but the importance of institutions was interesting because most of the other factors that came up significantly, you would probably have guessed before we even did this. But being near to the capital, being a capital city might not have necessarily been recognized as something that not only was predictive of size, but likely contributing to size. On the third paper, so what does our pyramid look like? How would we begin to figure this out? So in this slide, I'm sharing a list. You're not expected to go through every metric, but I wanted to share, I did a literature review of the federalism literature and studies that look at intergovernmental power. And there's different ways of measuring it. And so what I did was collated many of them and used them to create a composite that would help me to measure the relative power of each tier of government. So is that tier recognized in the Constitution? Does it have democratic elections? How much money can it spend? How much money can it raise? What kind of implementation responsibilities does it have relative to infrastructure? Who's doing the heavy lifting? So the image there, the composite measure I called power to lead. That was the power of the tier to lead economic development independently, to spearhead it, to sustain it without relying on other tiers to allow it or to fund it. And what's interesting here is that the federal and state governments are comparably strong. The federal government does have an edge, but they're pretty strong. The remarkable thing here is how weak local government is, given that Australia is a federation. And this is what the literature is saying as well, that we really aren't utilizing our local governments the way that we could. And so we looked at 3 different types of power: political power, fiscal power, and administrative power. So some observations about those powers. From a political sense, just the existence and autonomy of local governments in Australia is very compromised and volatile. So that was apparent in the other study with the statistical work, it was also apparent just in the literature and looking at what can local governments do. The fact that they can be abolished by the state government, and frequently are, is really interesting. And just a side note, in the United States, local governments have actually very similar constitutional standing, which is none. They are creatures of the state. But in practice, American states don't really change local governments or intervene too much, whereas in practice in Australia, they've been very heavy-handed in chopping and changing and moving things around. So an interesting cultural difference where it's legally they're identical. In terms of fiscal power, Australia has what's called vertical fiscal imbalance, actually extreme case. What that means is that the federal government is collecting in taxation far more than it needs to spend for federal responsibilities. And so the system is highly dependent on grants from the top down. And lower tiers have very little ability to raise the revenue that they need, and they're highly dependent on grants from above. And again, this is considered antithetical to federalism, which is all about devolving power downward, building capability downward. And so a lot of scholars of federalism suggest that there's been sort of a betrayal of the promises of federation. Also, local governments don't use much debt at all, given their creditworthiness. So in Australia, we have very reliable rate bases. People are going to pay their rates. We know what they're going to be. They're very predictable. That means great credibility. And yet we're not really using it to pull out debt or to secure debt and to implement infrastructure with those funds. And then in terms of administrative power, this is where you find Australia is quite decentralized. Each tier is doing quite a lot of heavy lifting. They have a lot to do. They've been given a lot of responsibility. The one caveat is that local government activities are highly prescribed. There's not a lot of autonomy in what they do. They're sort of told what to do. So the fourth paper, what do experts think is going on? So I wanted to share the roles that we were fortunate enough to have represented in the sample. Some heavy hitters at every tier of government. We had some federal ministers, senators, state premiers, state ministers, departmental CEOs at the state level. We had local government mayors and CEOs, and notable scholars in the field. So a lot of names that I cited in the literature review were kind enough to participate in this study. And lastly, we had some private sector involvement from Big Four consultancy partners who work with the government on infrastructure provision. And the questions were, why do you think we have primacy? Do you think there are growth constraints in the regions? If so, what are they? And should we do anything about this issue called primacy? And if so, what would you do about it? So we had 37 interviews. The vast majority of them would talk about institutions when I asked them, why do we have urban primacy? Other answers were given as well, but this was definitely the dominant answer. And specifically, they would speak in terms of sub-state government weakness and regional neglect. So either they had no power to do anything or they weren't getting enough attention, but this always was related to why the capitals were running away and then the regions were somewhat stagnant. Also, the vast majority agreed that primacy is very costly and that something should be done about it. And then when I asked, okay, so what would you do if you had to bucket them into one theme, they would talk about devolving power, different ways of empowering regions and enabling bottom-up leadership of development, putting them in the driver's seat. So at this point, here are the insights of the project. The institutional theory was not disproven. It appears very relevant. And specifically, there's no political institutional foundation from which bottom-up economic development can be independently spearheaded and sustained by sub-state governments. So in the literature, you'll read about the regions as having missed out or failed on opportunities. And I take issue with that we really can't speak of regions as having missed out or failing relative to their opportunities because they've never had the agency to be accountable for those things. You have to have agency to fail. And the reality is that development is beholden to top-down initiatives, which are rationally prioritizing existing settlements and population centers. So that all makes sense. That's not actually the problem that it's top-down. It's that it's only top-down, that there's no bottom-up to complement that system. That's what's remarkable about Australia, perhaps relative to Canada or the United States, which have quite a lot of bottom-up avenues for growth. And I wanted to share, I was at a conference last week called Regions Rising in Canberra, hosted by the Regional Australia Institute. And often many speakers would ask, why don't we have cities in the regions? Why aren't the regions growing? And my view is, I think we're starting to answer that question. We have to move on to new questions because we probably know now. You can't expect a city to grow if a city doesn't exist in the political sense. If it doesn't exist, how can it do anything? So the new questions really are how can we change that if we really do want if decentralization is a true goal that we have, how could we affect change? So I wanted to share the fifth paper, which was a little bit of a different paper, but it spoke to why does urban primacy matter? And in the literature, congestion costs in the primate city are often emphasized because primate cities often occur in developing countries. Mexico City is a famous case of a city that became so hyper congested, it became a national issue that we have to try to decentralize. This is untenable. It's hurting economic development. And there's also the issue of regional inequality that, regions aren't keeping up. We have this imbalance of uneven development. We have to do something. Also, but theoretically, in the literature, there's talk of opportunity costs and also sovereign risks. So sovereign risk being that the periphery may be subject to some sort of invasion or the neglected regions may revolt. But the opportunity cost is particularly important, and this next paper explored that. Because in theory, if you look at this picture, for you to have primacy, not only do you need one large city, but something has to be missing, otherwise it wouldn't stand out. But no one's really quantified what are the opportunity costs because it's very difficult to measure what's not there. How do you measure what's missing? So in this paper, I presented a theoretical model of what institutional economics were actually saying. What they're saying is, okay, if you change institutions, you change settlement because settlement is sculpted by institutions. So let's see if that's true. So in this image, I have two countries, and in time one, country A and country B are juxtaposed. Country A has urban primacy in its capital. Country B does not. It's decentralized. And country A is invaded by country B. Its periphery is taken over by country B. Now, in theory, these decentralized institutions should take over and decentralization would spread into country A. Is there a real world case of this? And I would say yes, there is one. And this paper was about this case study. So I'll just give you a brief history. In 1521, Spain settled Mexico City. They conquered the Native Americans and established Mexico City. And Mexico is one of the most well-examined cases of urban primacy in its capital. And that is thought to have been onset almost immediately with Spanish colonization, which was very centralized. Well, in the middle of the 19th century, an upstart, newly wealthy country had ideas about what could be done with New Spain's northern reaches and invaded it, the United States. And this gives you a sense of sort of what may have happened thereafter. So this paper is asking, was primacy disrupted in that northern invaded part? I just have it represented in a different way. So in the black outline is what was called New Spain for 300 years. And then it was invaded by the United States. And those little circles are the cities that are there today. But before, back when this was invaded, let's say in the mid-19th century, none of the cities in that light gray area existed. So the question is, was primacy disrupted? How do you go about measuring that? So one thing that I looked at was just measures of primacy through time. And I was able to locate city population metrics for a few centuries. I wasn't able to go back to the very beginning of Spanish settlement, but I was able to get about 40 years before the invasion. So I had a baseline of primacy in New Spain, and that the solid line is the full territory. So you may say, how can you compare two countries? The basis for this is there are 300 years of shared institutions. So if we just look at New Spain, around the time of the invasion, what happens is that San Francisco begins to take off and Los Angeles takes off soon after, and that disrupts the urban hierarchy relative to New Spain. And they begin to rival, and LA eventually, for a moment in time, eclipses Mexico City. So we have very low measures of primacy. Anything around 1 or below it's high, but it's not high. It's low. Sorry, I should say it's low. It means that the largest city is only it's about on par with the next two cities combined. Meanwhile, in what remained Mexico, primacy really takes off in earnest in the 20th century. So we see a divergence there. But also just looking at so this table shows you the top 10 largest cities every 50 years in New Spain. And if it's darkened, it means that the city is in what is still Mexico. And if it's white, it's in that northern part of New Spain. And you can see that cities start developing in that area and become quite large. They begin to rival Mexico City. And what's interesting is you might say, well, there were mineral deposits in the north. That's why it grew. Actually, scholars have shown that Mexico and New Spain was a treasure trove for centuries. It was the global mining epicenter for centuries. But the mining settlements in what is still Mexico would rise and fall with the wealth of their mines, whereas the ones that occurred, let's say, near San Francisco or outside of San Francisco, those cities pivoted into new industries and had some snowballing in terms of their growth. So by 2020, we see quite a lot of cities in the north. And the point of this paper was to say that why does primacy matter? It matters because what is hiding in its shadow. So for a primate city to exist, to stand alone, something is missing. We want to know what's missing. Arguably, that these cities in white are what was missing. These were the opportunity costs of primacy in Mexico. So you might ask, what can we do about this? Since if you're subscribing to this idea that maybe institutions are playing a role, I just wanted to share that just personally, I work in management consulting. I work remotely from Perth for a company in New York. And my day job is to develop operating models for corporations. So when they have a new division, we have to decide how you would configure people to get whatever that division is supposed to be doing done. And I'm sharing that because there was this interesting convergence between my day job and where I ended up going with this project, that it became the development of an operating model for the public sector in WA. So what will we do to affect change? So I'll share 5 recommendations, and then that will be the end of this. So the first recommendation is to commit to transcending a top-down paradigm. So if you were to survey decentralization initiatives in Australia, you'll find that they almost always possess this top-down orientation, that this centralized top is going to orchestrate decentralization. And that's not just an Australian phenomenon. That happens all over the world where primacy is. It's one of the most common mistakes of these efforts to try to decentralize. And really what the new paradigm's got to be is a centralized enablement and support of bottom-up economic development, so empowering local tiers. And I highlighted commitment because scholars of decentralization say it's really about the cultural commitment first. If you don't have buy-in at the top about the change, you can't expect to see it again. And that applies even in my profession. If you don't have corporate buy-in for some change that's happening in a corporation, no one is going to do anything. They may say they're going to follow, but no change is going to happen. If you can't refer to top-down, writing saying we're going to do this, it's very hard to implement change. The second one is to broaden own source revenue streams. So one of the big problems is that local government areas have very few own source revenues, meaning they have very little revenue that they can raise on their own and use how they like. Rates is one of their big ones. Parking is another big one. And without measurable elastic income, local government organizations lack a critical link between their operational and fiscal performance. And I'll give you an example. I spoke to one local government area counselor in an area that you would expect to have a lot of tourists. And it was this is after the interview, we're having a discussion. I said, I noticed you don't really have tourism adverts within Perth for people to come to your area or out of state or like, why don't you guys sell yourselves like that? And the counselor said, well, I'll give you an example. If we had an event and we pulled in 50,000 people, all we're going to see on our balance sheet are costs, crowd control, sanitation, you name it. We're going to see loads of costs. And yeah, local businesses will benefit from that. They're going to make income, but we won't see that in our balance sheets. We're going to depend on maybe getting a grant that helps to offset that. Whether the federal or state government recognize that we did that or not, we really can't be sure of. So we try to avoid that, and we'll just do events for our ratepayers because that's the revenue stream that we have some power over. And that's really interesting. If you go to Canada and the US, sales taxes at the local level are a huge driver of local revenues, and it feeds right back into the local government's performance. So this recommendation is to create tax room for locally derived and distributed sales taxes. So the way GST is currently distributed is it's supposed to be effort neutral. So if a local government waves its hand the most or does a really good job, it's not supposed to affect how much they get. It's meant to be per capita equity derived. And basically what I'm suggesting is some element of that should be effort derived. Some proportion should be earned here, stays here. So if the tax is received in Mandurah, it should come back to Mandurah. or at least give them a straight line in their accounting so they can see how grants were tied back to how well they did, because this would affect their performance. The third recommendation is to provide an oversight model option that decouples local and state government balance sheets. So one thing a lot of people wouldn't be aware of is that local governments are legally really just departments of the state government. So if a local government took out debt, for example, and defaulted and failed for whatever reason, that becomes the state's problem. It's legally obligated to begin to secure those debts. So that because of that, rationally, states are standardizing, micromanaging, and restraining local governments because they are fiscally and legally entangled. It makes sense. That's a rational approach. So the suggestion here is to implement local constitutions for qualifying councils. In the US, they're called home rule charters. One of the effects of these documents is it creates an autonomous fiscal entity. So the local government is its own piece of credibility. It's its own autonomous entity. And it helps to formalize local governments as credible. So this would, for qualifying local governments, maybe the oversight model would be a little bit less hands-off, a looser leash, allowing them to take out risks without the state being liable for those debts. It's no longer securing them. And interestingly enough, Mexico, which has recently begun to decentralize, just started doing that. The federal government no longer secures state or local debts. The fourth recommendation is to reconfigure just the sub-state government model. So I wanted to share sort of what the current state looks like. Of course, we have the federal government overseeing the state, and then the state is overseeing local governments and regional development commissions. Now, the federal government is almost duplicating that with its RDAs, the Regional Development Australia organizations. They're almost mirror copies, sometimes very close to one another in a regional center. Now, if these were individuals or departments within a large organization, you would say, wow, that Western Australian person has over 140 direct reports. That's a lot. Of course, they would want to standardize and keep things really simple. They wouldn't want autonomy. They wouldn't want their direct reports doing all different things because that's a lot to manage. So the recommendation here is to actually align them with one another. So having local governments reporting up to regional, regional reporting up to state, state reporting up to federal. This is similar to how Canada and the US are configured, where local governments roll up to counties, counties roll up to states or provinces, states or provinces up to federal. And it's important to note that I'm not suggesting any growth in government. There have been surveys that show that the public has zero appetite for that. This is about reconfiguring existing infrastructure, making better use of it, maybe taking state activities and devolving them into regional governments. So it's more digestible that now the state just has to look after 9 commissions. Okay, that's something we can work with. Maybe we could allow some diversity there. The regional development commissions are looking after maybe a dozen different local government areas. So just simplifying the chains of command, because a lot of the micromanagement that is sort of scathingly critiqued in the literature, if you look at how the state is built, you kind of can't blame them for managing things the way that they do. And the last recommendation is to pick winners and formalize regional capitals. So the problem I mentioned before is that cities as political units have a compromised existence. There's no bottom-up avenues. The recommendation is to formalize what it means to be a regional capital, to formalize that third tier of governments, what it means to be a capital at that tier. And I'm sharing that because one of the questions I had in doing this was, all right, I want to know why do we have primacy, but I'm also interested in why do places that don't have it not have it? What makes non-capital cities grow in Canada or the US? Why does Calgary exist? Los Angeles, Houston, Dallas. These are cities that have never been capitals of anything. They're actually capitals at a county level, which carries quite a lot of power. They can issue municipal bonds. They have power to self-start and to grow. So that's just another recommendation there that I think in simplifying the op model, the states also should pick one area, and it may not be popular with everybody, but it gives them a start and a focal point. So if you did all of these, one of the key success indicators is the existence of a municipal bond market. So where is all of this going? What are we trying to enable? There have been studies in Australia saying we should try a municipal bond market, and there's quite a lot of enabling legislation that will be required to do that. What a bond market is it's a way for a local government to secure debt finance on the capital market. So it would be like going out to all of us and saying, hey, we're going to issue a stock. It's rated A or B. We're looking for investment capital for a port. This has been a critical source of finance. If you really go back to the birth of cities like Los Angeles or Dallas or Houston, these non-capital cities, they've been totally reliant on municipal bonds. It's the main way that they have raised money when they were in the middle of nowhere. And to this day, bonds fund 2/3 of infrastructure in the U.S. It's a $4 trillion market. It's a critical indicator of local or regional autonomy and power. And it underlies that prevalence of these small, medium, and large-sized cities in the U.S. So I think the last thing I just mentioned, this is my final point, is in the literature, there's been hesitation to pick solutions. So when muni bonds were, for example, suggested, I followed up with scholars who wrote those papers and said, what happened with that? It was a great idea. And what ends up happening is if the solution doesn't fix the entire problem, it gets thrown out, which seems very wasteful. If you had a solution that could fix 50% of the problem, why would you be above it? So I think it's important that we recognize that some solutions aren't going to fix problems everywhere. Some areas have economic potential that can be enabled, others don't, and there's still going to be a problem even when you create all this enabling legislation. They're not going to be able to access a bond. They have no rate base. There's really still an issue there, but it doesn't mean that you've unlocked it. You may have, though, at the same time, unlocked potential in areas that had it. So that's it. Thanks for listening, and take your questions. Thanks.
Thanks, George. I haven't seen any questions in the chat. Has anyone got online or in the room got a question that they would like to ask George after his fantastic presentation? Amanda.
Hi, George. Thanks for that presentation. It was really interesting. I had a question, but you've answered it right at the end, which was about what about those places where there really isn't the capital for any sort of internal revenue raising, and surely they'll just get poorer. So my other question really is about how would you control for very perverse outcomes if you allowed more control at the local level to generate income? And we already see some perverse outcomes from what we currently have around rate spaces, where some local governments and areas go ahead and say develop housing on horticultural land because they're looking for a rate space, but the state loses the asset of the horticultural land. How would you control against that sort of perverse outcome where it might be against the state's interest?
I don't have a full answer, but I can answer that in part. I would say that we already have urban primacy is a huge diversity of outcomes. We have to recognize that what we have today is already, some would say, a perverse outcome. The measures of primacy and the scale at which we're exhibiting it in Australia is really off the charts. You'd be hard pressed to find a counterpart in the world that was similar, maybe Argentina. And what that really translates to is regional inequality between the capital and the regions. So it's sort of choosing between a situation where we have one winner, the capital, or we have multiple winners, but we still have issues, right? There still could be a diversity of outcomes. So I think, spruiking decentralization, it shouldn't be taken to be a be-all, end-all for everyone. I think if you go to the States, you can find cities that have had declining and increasing fates. They've done well, and then they've done very poorly over time. And how we would control that, how we would prevent that, I don't know. I think at least the area that I developed expertise was how to enable the development of potential where it exists. But you're right. If more areas start doing great, that means the areas that never had that opportunity are only going to get left behind. And this is part of the reason why we don't see, this has been one of the federal governments, and this is my idea, this is what I've read. The federal government's been striving for equality of outcomes because they want to try to prevent that. That's why they have effort neutral grant allocations, because they want it on a per capita equity basis. They're trying to keep people even to manage that issue. But all I would say is that we have to recognize the diversity outcome that we have now. We have giant states with really one region that's winning, as opposed to maybe giant states with multiple areas that are winning. But there will still, California, I think, is a great example where you could find very diverse. You go to the Central Valley, you'll see quite a lot of poverty. If you go to the coast, it's super rich. How do they control it? It's an open question. They're still working on it.
George, Peter Long, the royalties for regions was a fantastic success for Karratha, and people actually love coming and living here. It seems totally wrong to me that the agricultural and the mining regions, which together produce about 85% of the nation's export income, and export income is the real dollars. It's not GDP. Export income is actually money that's coming into the country. It always seems to me that the communities that actually produce this wealth some of that wealth should be able to come back to the community, and maybe a percentage of the value on that's shipped out or something like that. Did you consider that at all?
I didn't, other than that, I would suggest that the current grant allocation system, which is entirely effort neutral, or in theory it's supposed to be, probably shouldn't be. That some component, maybe not 100%, like right now, 100% of grant allocations are effort neutral. So it's really about how many people are in your region, and then we're going to allocate to you based on number of people and standard of service that exists now. So if you're remote, you may get still a little bit more per capita because you might need more. But if effort neutrality means if your region brought in most of the money, you're not necessarily going to get a better grant because of that. It has nothing to do with your contribution. So I would agree that there should be some element of this elastic income for the council, so that they can see, right, we did really great on this thing that we wanted to do. It brought in extra income, and we see it coming in through, we see it on our balance sheet, we see the reward. That incents the organization to continue to strive after that goal, however modest it is in the beginning.
And at the
I think
effort
this is
that's
why
actually
local sales taxes have been so effective in Canada and the US. For Canada's really transparent. If you were to tourist in Toronto and you get a receipt, you can see it right on the bottom. It'll show you, provincial tax, local tax, and that's going right back to the city or right back to the province. And that's a direct line for them to see, right, that tourism thing that we did in the New York Magazine, we think it actually brought people in, and we saw an increase in our income. I'm making it up, but you see those elastic incomes. I think,
Yeah.
Peter, what I heard you saying is that you don't see that.
No, well, it's you say it's equality of effort. It's not equality of effort, because the regions actually produce the lion's share of the actual income for the state, and then the return to them at best is a product of the population. When wealth is not to do with your population, wealth is to do with the actual efficiency of your exports. So you see what I mean? So the regions are done for because they've always got small populations. So even though the Pilbara, I think the average person in the Pilbara generates $750,000 a year, whereas the average in one of the capital cities is probably $60,000 or $70,000 a year. So there's no equality there at all. So I think it'd be somehow, if we could actually address that, it'd be better. It's a great paper, by the way. I love what you're doing. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Oh, we've got a question on the chat from Wayne for you, George.
Yeah.
You're modelling a market solution for decentralising. Fair. Should we be constraining capital cities at the same time to encourage alternative settlement / investment?
So I'm really speaking personally now. I don't subscribe to that, holding one city down to help others out. I think that actually could just hurt the whole system. I think if a regional center really has that kind of potential, it should be able to achieve it without holding another place down. So I get where that's coming from, but I don't necessarily subscribe to it. There is a little literature about moving capitals out of these primate cities. And even that has really, I think, variable success. It's been done in Nigeria did it. There's a fair few. Turkey did it. Turkey's a good example of a place where they moved it and it really didn't disrupt urban primacy at all. And Brazil moved their capital. I don't know if that's a prerequisite to decentralization, holding down or moving the capital city. I think empowering the region so you have bottom-up development is really the way to go, and it probably, doesn't necessarily have to be mutually exclusive to the capital.
Thanks, George. Hopefully that answered Wayne's question. I've got one for you, which is slightly different tact. So I think your first or second paper was looking at kind of environmental determinants and found that they hadn't shaped Australia's levels of primacy initially. So do you think that could change with climate change as some areas potentially become uninhabitable or less pleasant places to live?
So I think it would change the areas where you could have settlement, but primacy and climate, primacy is a very specific outcome in terms of settlement. So it's a shape, it's a specific shape. And you can get, like Saudi Arabia does not have urban primacy. It's a decentralized urban system. Israel is relatively decentralized. The Southwest, the US is decentralized. Some really cold parts of Canada are decentralized. So I don't know if it became such that it really constrained how much land into a tiny little pocket, then maybe you would expect primacy. The literature says that if a territory is anything bigger than 30,000 kilometers squared, you should see decentralization. So if it really pulled us into something that small, then maybe it would make sense that you just have one settlement. But I think it would neutralize potentially areas, but I don't necessarily know if it explains the shape of what we're seeing.
Okay, thanks. And then unless anyone else has got has anyone got any other questions for George?
Yeah, if I could, George, sorry. Yeah, again, really interesting presentation. And it speaks to also, I guess my field is more environmental management, and I think, and often it's advocated that devolving decision making down the scale to the local, on the ground. But I'm just thinking your take on urban primacy still speaks to that challenge that having more vibrancy in the regions should be something that is going to improve our management of those regions and the environments that they have there. So I just wondered if you might like to comment in that space, if you've got any opinions on that.
Just a little one. Something that came up in my interview, so it's not even my opinion, it's the opinion of some of the politicians that I spoke with who they really, the idea of decentralization, state politicians, they would often light up and really connect with this when they saw it as an avenue for local decision making. And that maybe that would help, because locals would maybe have a better sense of what sort of resources they need for environmental management. I could share no, I won't share that story, but that's my hardly informed answer. Sorry. I didn't look too closely at that, but I can share that that's what that really got people interested in this topic when they saw that as a potential, because I think they noticed that the top down wasn't working. And in particular, they saw it as a way to empower Indigenous communities in the regions to help them have more control over resource allocation.
Yeah, especially when the states really do all the environmental management. So yeah, I would agree with that.
I think Amanda's got a hand up for another question.
Yeah, sorry, I love asking questions. This is a great discussion. In your model, the final model, it had the 9 regions. They're rather arbitrary, although we're used to them. Would you maintain those 9 regions if you had a choice, or would you have a look at how those regions are formulated?
I don't know. That's a great question. I couldn't say, actually. What I would say is that third tier is really important. So one thing I did in my research was there's a global and world cities ranking. There's cities of economic importance. There's about 350 cities. And I was curious which of those were not capitals of anything. And that's how I identified that the US had like 3 dozen. The UK had a fair few. Canada had a handful. South Africa had a couple. And China had about a dozen. And I wanted to know why. And it was because these cities were seats of the third tier government. And all of these countries had really well developed third tiers of government. Now, what that looks like here, I don't know. You're right. I mean, maybe they're arbitrary. I know there's been debate and discussion about whether that's the right fit. So I don't know what they should look like, but I would say that whatever they become, that they should be empowered.
Thanks, George. We've got a few minutes left. I've got one more question for you, George. So your 5 recommendations, obviously very well considered and thought through and from your interviews, but have you done kind of any testing with anyone for like the appetite for these recommendations to kind of be enacted, so that, and sorry, horrible question, so that the chance of some of those things perhaps being adopted to make a change?
This is a great question. So I unfortunately couldn't include this in my paper, but I wanted to. All right, the long and short of it, I got this from the interviews because I wanted to know, what's the appetite, particularly state government people who had power to affect change. I think they said, yeah, this all makes rational sense. It's completely politically unviable. And that was sort of why I was compelled to write that paper about Mexico, to say there's risks in this and costs. And so if we're really making that choice, just have your eyes open. You could be missing a city. You could potentially have sovereign risks of leaving all that territory unpopulated if it really has that potential. I don't know. I mean, I went back after the interviews paper got published. I went back to one of the heavy hitters in the interview group to say, hey, I wrote this. Here you go. Maybe we could meet and talk. And this was a state person, and they basically said, oh, well, I think you should go see the federal government. And you can imagine what the federal government said. They told me to go see the state. So I think we're just at the beginning of this. There's a lot of talk about empowering regions, but when you really look at what it would take, it's very uncomfortable because the voter base is in the cities, and it's a hard political calculus for them.
It was thank you. Good answer. Oh, wait, there's something in the chat. Let me just have a look. Okay.
Joe's question there.
Yeah.
Okay, I see.
I'll let you say the question, then answer it. I'll mute myself.
All right, this is sort of out of scope of my studies, but I grew up in New Jersey, outside of Philadelphia, and we were on the Jersey side of a city in another state. And then New Jersey also is on the other side of New York. So I grew up in these cities that are segmented by boundaries and a whole bunch of small states. And then I went to uni out in California, which is a huge state. None of their cities are segmented. I've always been a fan of big states. It simplifies infrastructure provision. You're not segmenting urban sprawls with legislative boundaries that may or may not talk to one another. I think Detroit is one of the best examples of a city that's probably been damaged by a national boundary cutting right through the middle of it. A lot of people don't know that that's the most lopsided urban sprawl on the planet. So I actually think WA being big is to our advantage. Having these huge states is to our advantage. The one problem is if the only thing our system of government can grow is the state capital, then it becomes a limiting factor. And a good counterexample is Brazil. So Brazil is a lot like Australia. It only really has state capitals, but it has 42 states, I believe. So it has 42 cities of significant size, and it is decentralizing, but it's not growing non-capital cities. It's just got all these capitals that can grow. So maybe there is something to it. If you can't change the government, maybe you could change the states. I know Joe happens to be a fan of new states. Population policy. I don't know if I have an answer for that. I mean, you would, I guess, need to boost immigration, but I don't really have an answer to that. I think it's really about creating generative avenues of growth, regardless of how the population's growing, just enabling regions to capitalize on whatever intrinsic potential they have.
Okay. So in the interest of time, we're at the hour's nearly up. So it's the last call for any burning question that they'd like to put to George. Okay. Oh, yep, Fiona.
I just want to say, it's not a question. I just want to say that I think Julian and I have been really so fortunate to have such a talented PhD student. So thanks, George.
Thank you.
And thank you, George, for today. Thank you all for your time, both here in Audric. There's a small group of us and everyone who's joined online. It's very much appreciated. Here we are in the room. And so, yeah, again, just congratulations to George for getting this far and for a fantastic presentation. It's been really enjoyable and knowledgeable to listen to today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining.